Luis Alfredo Garavito was born on January 25, 1957, in Genova, a small rural town in the Quindío department of Colombia. At first glance, there was nothing that suggested he would grow into one of the most notorious serial killers in modern history. To the outside world, Genova was a peaceful town, surrounded by coffee plantations and rolling green hills. But beneath this picture-perfect landscape, Garavito's childhood was scarred by poverty, abuse, and neglect, conditions that would shape his violent path in the years to come. Garavito was the eldest of 7 children in a poor family that struggled to survive. His father, a violent alcoholic, ruled the household with fear. From an early age, Luis witnessed brutal fights between his parents, and when his father's anger flared, it was often directed at him. He was beaten with belts, sticks, and anything his father could grab in the heat of rage. His mother, overwhelmed with raising many children, offered little protection. Instead of being a source of comfort, she was often distant and cold, leaving Luis to face his father's wrath alone. As a boy, Luis was timid and withdrawn. Teachers remembered him as a child who rarely spoke and seemed to live in a world of his own. He did not excel in school, and his inability to focus made him fall behind his peers. Poverty meant he often went hungry, showing up to school in worn-out clothes, with no books or materials to help him learn. These struggles quickly made him a target for bullies. Isolated and humiliated, Garavito began to harbor feelings of resentment, anger, and shame, emotions that quietly grew inside him like a storm waiting to break. But the violence inside his home was not just physical. Psychological trauma played an equally damaging role. Reports later revealed that Garavito was sexually abused during his childhood, both by family members and neighbors. These experiences twisted his understanding of intimacy and power. Instead of forming healthy relationships, he learned that control, dominance, and exploitation were ways to cope with the chaos around him. Childhood sexual abuse is tragically common in the backgrounds of many serial killers, and for Garavito, it became one of the central building blocks of his future monstrosity. During his teenage years, Luis's life did not improve. His father forced him into grueling labor to support the family, and school became secondary. By the age of 14, he had dropped out uneducated and already hardened by abuse. Alcohol entered his life early, just as it had consumed his father. He drank heavily to numb the pain of his experiences, but it also gave him a false sense of courage and power. Friends and acquaintances described him as someone who was unpredictable when drunk, sometimes friendly, sometimes aggressive, but always unstable. Despite his troubled upbringing, Garavito outwardly presented himself as an ordinary young man. He worked in various low-paying jobs, including as a shop assistant, laborer, and eventually a traveling salesman. In these roles, he learned how to talk to people, how to gain their trust, and how to mask the darkness brewing inside him. He became skilled at blending in, presenting a facade of normalcy that would later allow him to get close to his victims without raising suspicion. But underneath the mask, Garavito was already showing disturbing signs of his inner world. He confessed later that during adolescence, he developed violent sexual fantasies. He dreamed of controlling, torturing, and harming others, particularly young boys. These thoughts terrified him at first, but instead of seeking help or even admitting them to anyone, he nurtured them in secret. Over time, his fantasies became more elaborate, more violent, and more specific. They gave him a sense of relief from the misery of his reality. But they also fueled a dangerous addiction that would demand real victims. In his early 20s, Garavito moved frequently, drifting from town to town across Colombia. He worked odd jobs, rarely holding a position for long. His drinking worsened, and he was known for being unreliable, often disappearing for days at a time. Yet, despite his instability, he managed to maintain a polite and sometimes even charming demeanor with strangers. To those who didn't know him well, he was just another struggling Colombian man trying to survive in a country already plagued by poverty, violence, and political unrest. Colombia in the 1970s and 1980s was a nation in turmoil. Drug cartels were rising. Political conflicts fueled bloodshed, and law enforcement struggled to maintain order. Thousands of children lived on the streets, abandoned or orphaned by violence, and became easy prey for predators. In this environment of chaos and neglect, someone like Luis Alfredo Garavito could move unnoticed. The system was too overwhelmed to track every missing child, and society was too desensitized to violence to recognize the danger he represented. By the time Garavito entered his 30s, the seeds planted during his childhood had fully taken root. He was no longer just a troubled man with dark fantasies. He was on the edge of acting upon them. His unresolved trauma, addiction to alcohol, inability to form normal relationships, and growing obsession with young boys all collided in a way that would soon erupt into unimaginable violence. Colombia was about to meet the man who would later be called La Bestia, the Beast. Looking back at his early life, psychologists have debated whether Garavito was shaped by his environment or born with inherent tendencies toward violence. His abusive childhood and sexual trauma undoubtedly influenced his development, but his cunning ability to manipulate, deceive, and hide his monstrous desires also points to a personality deeply rooted in psychopathy. Whatever the combination, the result was devastating. Luis Alfredo Garavito emerged from childhood not as a victim who broke the cycle, but as a predator who would inflict suffering on a scale rarely seen in human history. As Chapter 1 closes, we leave a picture of a boy who grew up in pain, molded by abuse, neglect, and violence. He was a child who never knew safety or love, and instead learned cruelty and fear as his first languages. But unlike millions of others who endure such hardships and manage to live without harming others, Garavito chose a darker path. His childhood was not just the beginning of his life. It was the beginning of a nightmare for hundreds of children who would later cross his path. As Luis Alfredo Garavito moved from adolescence into adulthood, the scars of his childhood did not fade. Instead, they hardened into something darker, something that would eventually consume him. By the time he reached his late teens, Luis was no longer just a victim of abuse and neglect. He was beginning to show the behaviors of a predator in the making. Garavito's early teenage years were marked by instability. After dropping out of school, he drifted from one menial job to another, never staying in one place long enough to build a stable life. He labored in farms, sold goods in small shops, and worked as a helper wherever he could earn a few pesos. But his inability to commit, combined with a growing reliance on alcohol, made him unreliable. Employers described him as polite at times, but moody and unpredictable. His drinking often left him aggressive and volatile, and it was during these drinking binges that some of his darkest impulses began to surface. By this point, Garavito was already battling a storm of disturbing thoughts. The violent sexual fantasies that had begun during his adolescence became stronger and harder to suppress. At first, he tried to resist them, but over time he began to feed them, letting them play out in his mind like secret films he replayed whenever reality became unbearable. These fantasies often involved young boys, helpless, vulnerable, and easy to control. For Garavito, who had grown up feeling powerless under the cruelty of his father and the neglect of his mother, the idea of total dominance over another being gave him a twisted sense of relief. His struggle with these urges created a double life. On the outside, he maintained the appearance of an ordinary Colombian man. He worked as a shop clerk, a street vendor, and eventually as a traveling salesman. These jobs required him to interact with people, and in doing so, he developed a talent for manipulation. He learned how to smile, how to charm, and how to appear trustworthy. These skills, honed in his early adult years, would later become his most dangerous weapons. But beneath the mask, his private life was unraveling. Garavito never formed healthy romantic relationships. He had brief affairs with women, but they were unstable and often marked by jealousy, insecurity, and bursts of anger. He never married, and despite his occasional attempts at companionship, he remained deeply isolated. Some acquaintances would later recall that there was always something off about him, an uneasiness that lingered after spending time in his company. Alcohol became his constant companion. By his early 20s, Garavito was drinking heavily, often to the point of blackout. It was during these drunken states that he began acting out his aggression, lashing out at others verbally and physically. Yet somehow, he managed to avoid serious consequences, slipping away from situations before they escalated into formal charges. Colombia at the time was chaotic, with police stretched thin by political violence, guerrilla warfare, and the rise of drug cartels. A violent drunk in a small town rarely attracted attention. It was also during this period that Garavito began to test the boundaries of his fantasies. He started by following children, watching them from a distance, and imagining what he could do if he had them under his control. These early behaviors were chilling precursors to the horrors that would come later. He was rehearsing in his mind, preparing himself to make the leap from fantasy to reality. Psychologists would later analyze this stage of his life and note the classic patterns of an emerging predator. Many serial killers begin with voyeurism, stalking, or smaller acts of cruelty before escalating. For Garavito, the escalation was inevitable. His childhood trauma had planted the seeds, and now his adult life, filled with loneliness, addiction, and unresolved rage, was watering them. During the 1980s, Colombia was a country overwhelmed by crisis, violence, poverty, and displacement left thousands of children on the streets. They begged for food, slept in alleyways, and trusted strangers for survival. For predators like Garavito, this environment was a hunting ground. The government lacked resources to protect these children, and families torn apart by war and poverty had little ability to fight for justice. Garavito began to use his charm and manipulative skills to lure children. He would approach them with gifts, promises of food, or offers of work. To a hungry, desperate child, a friendly man with a smile seemed like salvation. What they didn't know was that behind that smile was a man who saw them not as human beings, but as objects for his darkest desires. Still, during these early years, Garavito lived in constant conflict with himself. He confessed years later that he often prayed for his urges to go away. He sought out fortune tellers, priests, and even psychiatrists, hoping for a cure. But these efforts were shallow and inconsistent, often abandoned as soon as he felt the cravings return. His dependence on alcohol made self-control even weaker. And while part of him may have feared the monster inside, another part was growing addicted to it. The turning point came when his fantasies were no longer enough. He began experimenting with minor acts of abuse, manipulating and touching children inappropriately when he thought he could get away with it. These early crimes were hidden, whispered rumors among those who suspected something but had no evidence to act upon. In rural Colombia, such matters were often silenced, covered up by shame, or dismissed by authorities who had bigger crises to manage. This silence gave Garavito the confidence to push further. By the end of the decade, Garavito's pattern was set. He was an unstable drifter, moving from town to town, drinking heavily, forming shallow connections, and leaving behind whispers of misconduct. His fantasies had evolved into small acts of predation, and those acts were preparing him for the next step: full-scale violence. Looking back, it is chilling to consider how many warning signs there were. A childhood of abuse, an adolescence filled with disturbing fantasies, an adulthood marked by addiction and instability. These were all pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, revealed the shape of a serial killer. But in a country torn apart by larger tragedies, Luis Alfredo Garavito was able to slip through unnoticed. As Chapter 2 closes, we see a man who was no longer simply a broken victim of his past. He had made choices, step by step, that brought him closer to becoming the Beast of Colombia. His urges were sharpening, his methods were forming, and his confidence was growing. Soon, he would stop merely imagining his crimes. Soon, Colombia's children would begin to disappear. To understand how Luis Alfredo Garavito was able to commit his horrific crimes for so many years without being stopped, one must first understand the Colombia of his time. His reign of terror unfolded during one of the darkest and most violent chapters in the nation's history. Colombia in the 1980s and 1990s was a country overwhelmed by poverty, political instability, guerrilla warfare, and the ruthless power of drug cartels. In this environment, Garavito found not only opportunity, but also near total invisibility. The Colombia into which Garavito matured was fractured. Rural towns like his hometown of Ga Nova were marked by deep poverty. Families struggled to survive on subsistence farming and low-paying labor. Children were often forced to drop out of school to help support their families, leaving them vulnerable and unprotected. For many, the streets became their only home. The Colombian Institute of Family Welfare estimated that by the early 1990s, hundreds of thousands of children lived in extreme poverty, many of them completely abandoned. These children begged, scavenged, and trusted strangers for their next meal. For predators like Garavito, this environment was a hunting ground. He didn't need to break into homes or risk attacking protected children from wealthy families. Instead, he could walk through a bus terminal, a market, or a busy street corner and find dozens of desperate, hungry boys willing to follow a kind stranger who promised food, work, or money. But Colombia's tragedy was not just economic. It was also political. The nation was caught in a decades-long conflict between the government, left-wing guerrilla groups like the FARC and ELN, and right-wing paramilitary organizations. Violence was a daily reality. Entire villages were massacred, kidnappings were rampant, and assassinations of politicians, journalists, and community leaders were common. For ordinary Colombians, survival meant adapting to constant danger. In the midst of this chaos, the drug cartels rose to power. The Medellin cartel, under Pablo Escobar, and the Cali cartel turned Colombia into the epicenter of the global cocaine trade. Their wealth and violence destabilized the country further. Cities were rocked by bombings, car explosions, and bloody turf wars. Law enforcement, already stretched thin, was often corrupt or powerless against the cartel's influence. For a predator like Garavito, this national crisis was the perfect cover. The police were overwhelmed with assassinations, cartel wars, and political violence. The disappearance of a poor street child rarely made headlines, and even when families reported missing boys, the cases were often ignored or filed away with little investigation. The country was drowning in violence, and the cries of the poorest victims went unheard. Another factor that enabled Garavito was the cultural stigma around sexual abuse in Colombia during this time. Conversations about child molestation or pedophilia were almost taboo. Families who suspected abuse often remained silent out of shame or fear of gossip. When children disappeared, some assumed they had simply run away, fallen into the hands of guerrillas, or joined the thousands of displaced youths wandering the country. Few imagined that a single man could be preying on them systematically. It was also during this period that Colombia's internal displacement crisis exploded. As violence between guerrillas, paramilitaries, and the military intensified, millions of families were forced to flee their homes. Displaced children roamed cities like Bogotá, Cali, and Pereira, surviving however they could. They slept in bus stations, parks, or abandoned buildings. To Garavito, These children were invisible prey, society's forgotten, with no one to protect them, and often no one to notice when they were gone. Garavito himself took advantage of this instability by constantly moving. He was a drifter, traveling from city to city, town to town, often under the guise of work as a salesman. His mobility made him hard to track, and his victims were scattered across multiple regions of Colombia. When children began disappearing in one area, Garavito would simply move to another. In a country where missing children were already common, the pattern was nearly impossible to detect at first. The 1980s and 1990s were also decades of distrust between citizens and law enforcement. Corruption was rampant, and many Colombians believed the police were either incapable or unwilling to protect them. This mistrust meant that many families didn't bother reporting crimes, and when they did, reports often languished in bureaucratic limbo, lost among mountains of paperwork in an overburdened justice system. This institutional weakness created the perfect storm in which a predator could thrive. The Catholic Church, a powerful institution in Colombia, also played a role in silencing discussions of sexual violence. While priests and nuns often worked to help the poor, the church also perpetuated an atmosphere of denial when it came to issues like pedophilia. Religious institutions emphasized morality and sin, but offered little practical protection for vulnerable children. Garavito, who sometimes presented himself as a religious man and even carried prayer books, used this cultural shield to gain trust. By the early 1990s, Colombia had become one of the most violent countries in the world. With an average of 30,000 homicides a year, the murder rate was among the highest globally. Against this backdrop of constant bloodshed, Garavito's crimes barely registered in the national consciousness. The disappearances of poor boys blended into the background of kidnappings, massacres, and cartel executions. This chaos gave Garavito more than just opportunity. It gave him confidence. He realized that he could abduct children in broad daylight, lure them with promises of work or gifts, and nobody would stop him. He understood the weaknesses of the system, and he exploited them with chilling precision. He targeted the forgotten and the voiceless, knowing that their suffering would be hidden by Colombia's larger tragedies. Looking back, it is impossible not to wonder, could Garavito have been stopped sooner if Colombia had been a more stable country? If the government had stronger institutions, if law enforcement had the resources to investigate missing children, if poverty had not forced so many onto the streets, would he have been caught before the body count reached into the hundreds? These questions haunt Colombia's memory of the beast. As Chapter 3 closes, we see how Garavito's rise as a predator was not only the result of his own twisted psychology, but also a reflection of a nation in crisis. Colombia's turmoil created the shadows in which he could hide, the silence that allowed him to continue, and the suffering that made his victims invisible. While the country was consumed with wars against cartels and guerrillas, a different war was being waged quietly in its streets, a war against its children, carried out by one man who knew how to move unseen. When Luis Alfredo Garavito finally crossed the line from fantasy into reality, it was as if a door had opened that could never again be shut. His first killings were not random outbursts of violence, but carefully staged acts that mirrored the fantasies he had nurtured for years. They were rehearsals come to life, and once he had tasted the sensation of absolute control over another human being, he knew he could never turn back. Investigators later pieced together fragments of his earliest murders from confessions, forensic evidence, and scattered witness accounts. The common thread in these crimes was opportunity. Garavito targeted children who were already forgotten by society: street boys, runaways, orphans, and those struggling in poverty. Many of them were found near bus stations or city marketplaces, where hungry and desperate children were most visible. He approached them with disarming charm, speaking softly, promising food, or offering the chance to earn a little money carrying goods. The killings followed a disturbing ritual. Garavito would walk with the child to a secluded place, often just beyond the edge of town. He knew Colombia's rural landscape well: abandoned farmland, sugarcane fields, remote paths leading into hills. There, away from watchful eyes, his true nature emerged. He bound his victims, often using rope or strips of cloth. He blindfolded them to heighten their terror and to strip them of their last sense of control. What followed was torture. Evidence from crime scenes and Garavito's own chilling admissions later revealed that he subjected his victims to prolonged suffering before finally killing them. Many bodies bore signs of stabbing, deep cuts, and fractured bones. Some were decapitated or mutilated. He carried out these acts with a mixture of cruelty and ritual, as though each murder was both a performance of power and an exorcism of his own inner demons. Afterward, Garavito often wept. He admitted that after the first murders, he collapsed into despair, drinking heavily, begging God for forgiveness, and swearing he would never do it again. But the cycle repeated itself. The cravings returned stronger each time, pulling him back into violence. He told investigators years later that the urge was uncontrollable. A demon, he called it, though psychologists would later interpret it as compulsion rooted in his abuse, trauma, and psychopathy. What makes these first murders especially haunting is how unnoticed they went. In a country already overwhelmed by kidnappings, massacres, and guerrilla violence, the disappearance of a poor boy barely registered. For families who did notice, the police response was slow or non-existent. In many cases, families did not even report missing children, either because they feared gossip, assumed the child had run away, or felt hopeless about the authorities' ability to help. This silence emboldened Garavito. With each murder, he grew more confident. He learned how to avoid detection, how to choose isolated areas, how to travel between towns without leaving a trail. He even developed disguises to make himself appear trustworthy. Sometimes he dressed neatly with glasses, looking like a businessman. Other times he posed as a monk or a charity worker, carrying prayer books to convince children he was a man of God. He adapted to whatever would inspire trust. By the early 1990s, Garavito's pattern was firmly established. He drifted constantly across Colombia, never lingering long enough to arouse suspicion. Each new town brought new victims, and the cycle of murder continued. In some regions, bodies began to appear. Mutilated remains discovered in sugarcane fields or on the outskirts of small villages, but without a centralized system to connect cases across provinces. Authorities treated each discovery as an isolated tragedy. For Garavito, the first killings were like a test. He was learning not just how to murder, but how to refine his method. He carried what investigators later described as a murder kit: ropes for binding, blades for torture, alcohol for both himself and sometimes his victims. He was methodical, leaving behind as little evidence as possible. Yet even when bodies were found, the brutality was so extreme that locals assumed the killers were cartel enforcers or guerrilla fighters, not a single man preying on children. His earliest victims became the forgotten beginnings of a killing spree that would shock the world. They were boys who had names, faces, and families. Though history often reduces them to numbers in Garavito's long list of confessions, they were the children of poverty, invisible to most of Colombia, and it was their invisibility that allowed Garavito to continue unchecked. Each murder deepened his addiction. He confessed years later that the first killings gave him a sense of relief, unlike anything else, but it was fleeting. Soon, the cravings returned, more powerful than before. He began to plan his next abduction even before the memory of the last one faded. He lived in a state of constant hunger, an appetite not for food or money, but for domination, violence, and control. Psychologists studying Garavito later suggested that these first murders were the tipping point where fantasy fused permanently with reality. For years, he had survived by imagining. But once he acted, the fantasy lost its power to satisfy him. From then on, only real victims could feed the beast inside him. His compulsions escalated rapidly, and the number of his victims grew. By the mid-1990s, Garavito had left behind a trail of bodies scattered across Colombia, though few people recognized that the deaths were connected. Police in different towns treated them as isolated crimes, and families of the victims rarely had the power to demand nationwide investigations. The chaotic state of Colombia worked in his favor. In many ways, his first murders were the proof of concept, demonstrating that he could kill again and again in plain sight of a distracted nation without consequence. As Chapter 4 closes, we see Garavito not just as a man who killed, but as a predator who had perfected his method. The first murders were the birth cries of La Bestia, the Beast of Colombia. They revealed his hunger, his cruelty, and his cunning. Most of all, they showed him that he could get away with it. And once he knew that, there was no turning back. The first murders were only the beginning of a nightmare that would soon engulf an entire nation. By the early 1990s, the killings of Luis Alfredo Garavito were no longer isolated acts of violence. They had become a relentless campaign of terror against Colombia's most vulnerable. His first murders had taught him that he could operate undetected, and with each success, his confidence grew. Soon, The disappearances of boys across the country reached staggering levels. Entire communities whispered of missing children. Yet few realized that one man was orchestrating this silent massacre. The scale of Garavito's crimes is almost impossible to comprehend. He confessed to killing more than 140 boys, though investigators believe the real number may exceed 200. To put that in perspective, he murdered more children than many of the world's most infamous serial killers combined. But this truth only became clear much later. At the time, the disappearances were scattered across Colombia, hidden in the shadows of a nation already consumed by larger tragedies. Street children were his primary targets. Colombia's economic collapse and ongoing conflict created thousands of vulnerable boys living on sidewalks, bus terminals, and train stations. Many were orphans, displaced by guerrilla warfare, or abandoned by families who could not afford to feed them. For Garavito, these children were ideal victims. No one to protect them, no one to demand answers when they vanished. His method remained consistent. He would strike up conversations with boys between the ages of 6 and 16, offering them food, clothing, or the promise of work. Sometimes he presented himself as a kind uncle figure, other times as a religious man on a mission of charity. His ability to gain trust was chilling. Many survivors, children who narrowly escaped his traps, later recalled how convincing he was, how he seemed safe, even fatherly. Once the child agreed to follow him, Garavito led them out of sight. Sugarcane fields, abandoned houses, wooded hillsides. These were his chosen killing grounds. The bodies later discovered bore marks of unspeakable cruelty. Victims were tied, blindfolded, tortured, and mutilated. Many were sexually assaulted before death. The brutality was not random, it was ritualized, as though Garavito was replaying his darkest fantasies with each new victim. For communities, the sudden rise in missing children was devastating. Families searched desperately, plastering photos on walls and begging police for help. In some towns, multiple boys vanished within weeks, creating an atmosphere of dread. Parents warned children not to talk to strangers, yet the abductions continued. But because Garavito moved constantly from region to region, few realized that the disappearances were connected. Colombia's law enforcement was ill-equipped to detect a pattern. Each town treated its missing children as a local issue, rarely sharing information with neighboring regions. In a country overwhelmed by cartel violence, guerrilla warfare, and political assassinations, the plight of poor street children ranked low on the list of national priorities. Even when bodies were found, mutilated and discarded, authorities often blamed guerrilla fighters or drug traffickers. The idea that one man could be responsible for so many deaths seemed unthinkable. But whispers began to spread. Teachers noticed when entire groups of students stopped showing up. Social workers in larger cities recorded alarming increases in disappearances. Journalists began to ask questions. Still, the connection was blurry, the evidence scattered, and Garavito remained hidden in the chaos. His killing spree escalated dramatically between 1994 and 1997. During these years, dozens of boys disappeared every few weeks, particularly in areas like Val del Cauca, Risaralda, Quindio, and Meta. Entire neighborhoods lived in fear, and yet Garavito continued to travel freely, moving from one hunting ground to another. His mobility, combined with his talent for disguise, made him a ghost. Survivor testimonies later painted a disturbing picture. A few boys managed to escape before Garavito could carry out his rituals. They described a man with glasses, sometimes limping, sometimes dressed as a priest or a salesman. They recalled how he promised them food or jobs, only to lead them into isolated areas. These warnings, however, were rarely taken seriously at the time. Street children were often dismissed as liars or troublemakers, their voices silenced by society's indifference. As the disappearances multiplied, Colombia was forced to confront an unthinkable possibility: that a predator was hunting its children on a massive scale. The nickname, La Bestia, began circulating in hushed tones, a whisper of a monster who preyed on boys. Yet no one knew his face, and no one could stop him. Psychologists who later studied Garavito emphasized the compulsive nature of his spree. He was addicted to the act of killing. Each murder provided a temporary release from the inner torment that had haunted him since childhood. But the relief never lasted. He needed to kill again, and soon. This compulsion drove him to escalate, abducting more children in shorter periods of time, leaving behind more bodies in the fields and forests of Colombia. The tragedy of this chapter is not only the number of lives lost, but also the silence that surrounded them. These were not children from wealthy families whose disappearances would spark headlines. They were the invisible children of Colombia, the poor, the displaced, the forgotten. Their absence was a wound felt only in their immediate communities, rarely acknowledged by the nation as a whole. Yet, despite the lack of urgency, signs of Garavito's crimes were everywhere. Mass graves of children began to appear in some regions. Investigators discovered multiple bodies dumped in the same field, all showing the same pattern of torture and abuse. Slowly, a horrifying realization was dawning. These deaths were not isolated. They were connected. By the late 1990s, fear had spread to a national level. Parents, teachers, and social workers began to pressure authorities for answers. The government, under intense scrutiny, was forced to act. Police finally began connecting the dots between the disappearances and the bodies turning up across the country. They didn't yet know his name, but they knew this Colombia was facing a predator unlike any it had ever seen. As Chapter 5 closes, the image of a nation haunted by vanishing children comes into focus. Entire communities lived in fear, and yet the predator moved freely, hunting wherever he wished. The number of victims was climbing at an astonishing rate, but still Garavito remained unseen. The stage was set for one of the most chilling manhunts in Colombian history. A search not for a guerrilla fighter or a cartel assassin, but for a single man who had declared war on the nation's children. By the late 1990s, the shadow of Luis Alfredo Garavito had stretched across Colombia. Entire towns whispered of missing boys. Entire provinces reported mutilated bodies, yet the predator remained unseen. Authorities, knew they were dealing with something unprecedented, but the pieces of the puzzle were scattered across a nation already torn apart by war, drugs, and corruption. It would take one horrifying discovery to finally pull those fragments together and to begin revealing the monster behind the mask. In 1997, investigators in the town of Palmyra, in Val del Cauca, stumbled upon a grim scene. The remains of several children were found in a sugarcane field, their bodies showing signs of torture and ritualized violence. The similarity of wounds matched those found in other parts of the country. Forensic examiners noted the bindings, the mutilations, and the blindfolds, details that were too specific to be coincidence. Slowly, law enforcement began connecting the dots. At first, the idea seemed unbelievable. Could a single man really be responsible for so many murders scattered across Colombia? Investigators hesitated, but as reports continued to flood in from Risaralda, Quindio, and Meta, the pattern became undeniable. They were dealing with one killer, a man hunting children on an unimaginable scale. The search intensified. Police began canvassing bus stations, schools, and markets where boys were last seen. Survivors who had escaped abduction attempts came forward, describing a man with glasses, a limp, and a persuasive charm. He sometimes posed as a priest, sometimes as a charity worker, sometimes as a salesman. He was always offering food, money, or jobs. These testimonies gave investigators their first composite sketches of the suspect, who would soon be called by his infamous nickname, La Bestia, the Beast. But Garavito was cautious. He moved constantly, drifting from town to town, rarely staying long enough to raise suspicion. He carried false identification papers and used disguises to mask his identity. His mobility made him almost untouchable. For years, he had hidden in plain sight, a predator operating under the chaos of Colombia's violence. What ultimately betrayed him was his compulsion. Garavito could not stop killing, and the volume of his crimes began leaving trails even he could not erase. In 1997, near the town of Ga Nova in Quindio, authorities made a discovery that would become the turning point. In a rural field, they uncovered the remains of dozens of boys, all killed in the same brutal manner. This was not just a crime scene, it was a mass grave. The sheer number of victims shocked investigators into action. They realized they were not chasing a typical murderer. This was a predator of historic proportions, and his crimes could no longer be dismissed as isolated tragedies. The Colombian government, pressured by journalists and grieving families, began devoting resources to finding the man responsible. The investigation grew more sophisticated. Forensic experts compared DNA evidence from multiple crime scenes. Behavioral analysts studied the killer's methods, identifying patterns of movement and ritual. Police cross-referenced missing children reports with known sightings of a suspicious man traveling alone. Slowly, the net began to tighten. It was in 1999 that Garavito finally made a mistake. Near Villavicencio, in Meta, authorities discovered yet another mass grave. This time, investigators found items left behind, discarded glasses, clothing, and a torn piece of paper with names and addresses. The glasses were distinctive, thick, lensed, and prescribed for severe myopia. When investigators checked optometrists in the area, they identified a patient who matched the description given by survivors. Luis Alfredo Garavito. The breakthrough electrified the case. For the first time, the beast had a name. Police traced Garavito's movements, learning that he often stayed in cheap motels, drifting from job to job, always in search of new hunting grounds. Witnesses described him as polite, talkative, sometimes overly friendly with boys. He blended into communities easily, hiding his monstrosity behind a mask of normalcy. But Garavito was unraveling. His compulsion to kill had become uncontrollable, and his alcoholism was worsening. He drank heavily after his crimes, sometimes leaving behind bottles or personal belongings near the scenes. In Villavicencio, police found one such bottle, along with blood-stained clothing that would later be tied to him through forensic testing. The evidence was mounting. The hunt ended when Garavito was arrested in April 1999. Police caught him near Villavicencio after he attempted to abduct another boy. By then, his face had been circulated widely, and suspicions about his involvement were growing. Once in custody, investigators confronted him with the evidence. The glasses, the belongings, the testimonies of survivors. The beast had finally been unmasked. At first, Garavito denied everything, but confronted with overwhelming proof, he began to break. Over weeks of interrogation, he confessed in chilling detail to crimes that left even seasoned investigators shaken. He described his methods, his disguises, his rituals, and the compulsion that drove him to kill. He admitted to more than 140 murders, guiding police to the sites where he had buried bodies. Each new revelation uncovered more victims, more horror, more proof of the nightmare he had unleashed on Colombia. The confessions were staggering, not only for their number, but for their cold precision. Garavito remembered names, ages, and locations. He spoke of the children as if cataloging possessions, a testament to his detached cruelty. For investigators, the magnitude of his crimes was almost beyond comprehension. They had caught one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history. News of his capture spread rapidly. Across Colombia, parents wept, journalists swarmed, and communities tried to comprehend the scale of the tragedy. The man who had seemed like a ghost, a legend whispered in fearful tones, was now revealed to be an ordinary-looking man, a middle-aged figure with glasses, a limp, and a disarming smile. There was no monster in the shadows, no supernatural beast. There was only Garavito, a man whose evil had outpaced imagination. As Chapter 6 closes, we leave the moment when Colombia finally put a face to its nightmare. The years of silence and confusion were over. The beast had been unmasked, and his crimes would soon be laid bare in court. But though his capture brought relief, it also raised haunting questions. How could one man commit so many murders unnoticed for so long? How had society allowed so many children to vanish before anyone truly acted? The answers and the reckoning would come in the chapters that followed. When Luis Alfredo Garavito was finally in custody, Colombia braced itself for a trial unlike anything it had ever seen. The capture of Bestia had shocked the world, But what came next revealed the full scope of his crimes. Courtrooms, journalists, families of victims, and even hardened police officers listened as the man before them confessed to atrocities that stretched the limits of human comprehension. It was not just a trial of one man. It was the trial of a nation's deepest wound. From the very beginning, Garavito cooperated with investigators, though not out of remorse. He seemed eager to boast, almost proud of his ability to outwit authorities for so many years. He provided maps and directions to burial sites, helping police uncover bodies scattered across Colombia. Each discovery brought confirmation of his guilt, and with it, unimaginable grief for families who had spent years searching for missing children. Court records later showed that Garavito confessed to killing 147 boys, though authorities estimated the number could be far higher, perhaps over 200. The details were chilling in their precision. He recalled names, ages, and even the clothing some boys were wearing when he lured them away. His memory was not clouded by alcohol or time. Instead, it was disturbingly sharp, as though he relived each crime when speaking about it. The trial proceedings were long, drawn out, and deeply painful for the Colombian public. Unlike cartel leaders or guerrilla commanders who faced charges of murder and terrorism, Garavito stood accused of something far more intimate: the systematic slaughter of children. Each charge carried its own weight, and prosecutors painstakingly built their case with forensic evidence, survivor testimony, and Garavito's own confessions. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy with grief. Parents of victims attended the hearings, clutching photographs of their lost sons. Many broke down as Garavito spoke about his methods, his rituals, and the way he chose his victims. For them, the trial was not only about justice, but also about answers. They wanted to know what had happened to their children, even if the truth was unbearable. Psychologists and criminologists were called to testify, attempting to explain how one man could commit so many crimes. They described Garavito as a psychopath with deep-seated trauma from childhood abuse, alcoholism, and a compulsive sexual disorder. Yet even with these explanations, no one in the courtroom could fully comprehend the scale of his evil. The label, monster, seemed inadequate, but no other word came close. As the evidence mounted, there was no doubt about the outcome. Garavito was guilty. The only question was how Colombia's justice system would punish him. Under Colombian law at the time, the maximum sentence for any crime, even for multiple murders, was 30 years in prison. Later reforms extended this to 40 years, but even then, it seemed grotesquely inadequate for a man who had taken more than 100 lives. When the judge read the sentence, the nation was stunned. Garavito received 853 years in prison. It was a symbolic ruling, a way of acknowledging the enormity of his crimes. But in reality, because of sentencing limits, he could only serve a maximum of 40 years. For many Colombians, this was a second wound. How could justice for hundreds of murdered children amount to just a few decades behind bars? Public outrage was immediate and fierce. Families demanded reforms, arguing that Colombia needed harsher penalties for crimes of this magnitude. Politicians debated reinstating the death penalty or introducing life imprisonment, both of which were prohibited under the Constitution. The trial of Garavito reignited a national conversation about justice, punishment, and the value of human life. Inside prison, Garavito remained a peculiar figure. Reports described him as cooperative with authorities, often providing additional details about his crimes. At times, he expressed regret, claiming he wished for forgiveness. At other times, he appeared detached, speaking about the murders as if recounting someone else's story. His behavior left psychologists divided. Was he truly remorseful, or was he merely manipulating those around him? What haunted many was the possibility of his release. If granted parole for good behavior, Garavito could theoretically leave prison after serving just 22 years. The thought of La Bestia, walking free, was unbearable for Colombians, especially for families of victims. Newspapers ran headlines warning the public. Citizens petitioned the government to prevent his release at any cost. The trial also exposed systemic failures. It showed how Colombia's fragmented law enforcement had allowed Garavito to move freely for years. It revealed how society's neglect of poor children had created a pool of victims no one protected. And it highlighted how weak sentencing laws failed to reflect the magnitude of crimes against humanity. Still, the trial brought one measure of closure. Families who had long searched for answers finally knew what had happened to their children. The courtroom gave them space to grieve publicly, to speak their sons' names, and to demand justice in front of the nation. Though no punishment could bring back the lost boys, the trial ensured their deaths would not remain invisible. Internationally, Garavito's case drew headlines as one of the worst serial killings in history. Criminologists compared him to killers like Pedro L. Lopez, the monster of the Andes, who had also hunted children across South America. But Garavito's crimes were uniquely horrifying in scale and cruelty. He became a case study in evil, his name forever associated with the darkest chapters of humanity. As Chapter 7 closes, the image of Garavito sitting in court remains burned into memory. A man who looked ordinary, almost forgettable, yet carried within him the deaths of hundreds. The trial may have unmasked him, judged him, and sentenced him. But the questions it raised continued to echo across Colombia. Could justice ever be enough? Could a nation ever heal from wounds this deep? The answers were uncertain, but one thing was clear. Garavito's reign of terror had ended. The beast was caged. Yet the scars he left behind would last for generations. When the trial ended and Luis Alfredo Garavito was locked away, Colombia exhaled a sigh of relief. The monster who had haunted its children for nearly a decade was finally caged. Yet even behind prison walls, Garavito's presence loomed large. His name remained a symbol of horror, his crimes a wound that refused to heal. The question now was what life would look like for the Beast of Colombia in captivity. Garavito began his sentence in maximum security, under close watch. He was not treated like a typical inmate. His notoriety made him both a target and an object of fascination. Other prisoners despised him, even among thieves, traffickers, and murderers, crimes against children carried a special stigma. Rumors spread that Garavito received threats daily. Guards reported that he often kept to himself, avoiding interactions with fellow inmates whenever possible. In the early years, prison records showed Garavito struggling with alcoholism and health issues. Years of heavy drinking had damaged his body, and he required frequent medical attention. He also developed diabetes and vision problems that worsened with age. These ailments earned him occasional sympathy from staff, but for most Colombians, the idea of Garavito receiving care only deepened their anger. Psychologists continued to study him during his incarceration. Interviews painted a disturbing portrait. At times, Garavito expressed remorse, saying he wished he could undo his crimes and asking God for forgiveness. At other times, he spoke coldly and analytically, describing his murders with the same detachment one might use to recount daily errands. Experts disagreed on whether his remorse was genuine or a manipulative act designed to gain leniency. What unsettled many was Garavito's apparent adaptability. He participated in prison activities, occasionally attending workshops or religious services. Reports suggested he tried to present himself as a changed man, reading the Bible and speaking about redemption. Yet to the families of his victims, these gestures meant nothing. They saw them as attempts at performance, another mask worn by a man who had mastered deception. The possibility of his release haunted Colombia. Because of sentencing laws, Garavito's effective prison term was capped at 40 years, and with good behavior, he could be released even earlier. This meant that, theoretically, the most prolific child murderer in history might one day walk free. The idea sparked public outrage. Newspapers ran stories warning that La Bestia could be back on the streets. Families of victims organized campaigns demanding reforms to ensure Garavito would never again see freedom. Politicians faced pressure to act. Debates erupted over whether Colombia should amend its constitution to allow life sentences or even the death penalty for crimes of this scale. Some argued that keeping Garavito imprisoned until death was the only way to honor the memory of his victims. Others warned that changing the law in reaction to one man would undermine Colombia's legal principles. The controversy kept Garavito's name in headlines long after his trial. Inside prison, Garavito aged. The once energetic predator grew frail. Photographs from the 2000s and 2010s show a man whose hair had grayed, whose body had weakened, and whose limp had worsened. His health became a frequent subject of reports. He suffered from eye problems, diabetes, and cancer in his later years. For many, this decline was seen as a small measure of justice. The beast was wasting away behind bars. Yet, he never stopped being studied. Criminologists and psychologists visited him to better understand the mind of a serial killer. His case became a reference point for law enforcement training, not just in Colombia, but around the world. He remained both a criminal and a case study, a warning of how unchecked trauma, poverty, and opportunity could create a predator of historic proportions. Despite his confinement, Garavito's crimes continued to reverberate outside prison walls. Every few years, New burial sites were discovered, adding to the tally of his victims. Each discovery reopened wounds for families and reignited public anger. Even decades later, parents would still come forward, asking if Garavito might have been responsible for the disappearance of their child. His shadow stretched far beyond his cell. In interviews during his incarceration, Garavito occasionally spoke about his past. He blamed childhood abuse, alcoholism, and uncontrollable urges for his crimes. At times, he called himself a victim of his own compulsions. These statements infuriated families and experts alike, who saw them as excuses rather than accountability. To them, Garavito was not a man trapped by fate. He was a predator who made choices, again and again, to destroy innocent lives. The debate over his imprisonment continued for years. Could a man like Garavito ever be rehabilitated? Should society even attempt to forgive someone who had murdered so many children? Most Colombians answered with a resounding no. Forgiveness was impossible. Rehabilitation was meaningless. The only acceptable outcome was that Garavito would die in prison, never again able to harm another soul. And indeed, that is what happened. In 2023, after more than 2 decades behind bars, Luis Alfredo Garavito died of natural causes. His death closed a chapter in Colombian history, but it did not erase the pain he caused. For some, it was a relief to know that the beast would never again breathe free air. For others, it was a reminder of the countless lives lost, a grief that no prison sentence or death could ever heal. As Chapter 8 closes, the image of Garavito behind bars lingers, an aging, frail man, far removed from the predator who once stalked Colombia's children. Yet the walls of his prison could never contain the enormity of his crimes. His captivity brought safety, but not closure, justice, but not peace. For the families of his victims, life behind bars was not enough. It could never be enough. Still, it ensured that the beast's reign of terror ended where it belonged, in a cell, in darkness. In October 2023, news broke across Colombia that Luis Alfredo Garavito, La Bestia, the Beast, was dead after more than 2 decades in prison. The man who had murdered over 100 children took his final breath in a hospital bed. His death did not come by violence or vengeance, but by natural causes. For many Colombians, the ending felt anticlimactic. A monster who had inflicted unimaginable suffering had simply wasted away into frailty, his body giving up before justice ever truly could. Garavito had been transferred several times between prison facilities and hospitals in his final years. His health had deteriorated sharply. He suffered from diabetes, hypertension, vision loss, and cancer. He was often too weak to walk without assistance, and photographs released in the last years of his life showed an almost unrecognizable figure, gaunt, frail, and hunched over. The man who once lured children with promises of food and work had become a shadow of himself, consumed by age and disease. When the announcement of his death came, reactions were swift and divided. Some greeted it with relief, believing Colombia could finally close the chapter on its darkest predator. Others were angry, feeling cheated that Garavito had escaped true punishment. He had died on his own terms, not by execution, not by the full weight of justice, but by the inevitable decline of the body. For the families of victims, his death stirred complex emotions. Some mothers and fathers wept, not out of mourning, but out of unresolved grief. The death of Garavito did not bring back their children. It did not erase the decades of pain, the endless nights wondering what had happened, the absence that remained in their homes. For them, his death was simply another event in a story that had already stolen everything. In towns where Garavito had once hunted, his death sparked conversations about memory and justice. Community leaders reminded citizens that while the beast was gone, the lessons of his crimes must not be forgotten. The vulnerability of Colombia's poor and displaced children had allowed Garavito to operate for so long. His death was a reminder that those vulnerabilities still existed, and without vigilance, another predator could rise. Internationally, headlines spread the news quickly. The world's worst serial killer is dead. Criminologists revisited his case, comparing him again to Pedro L. Lopez, the monster of the Andes. But while LD Pez had vanished after release, Garavito died behind bars, still under the control of the system that had finally caught him. Scholars and law enforcement experts noted that his case remained one of the most important studies in criminal psychology, a horrifying lesson in how trauma, opportunity, and systemic neglect could converge to create a killer of historic proportions. Yet, even as experts analyzed him, ordinary Colombians expressed disdain that his death occurred in a hospital, under care, when his victims had died in agony in sugarcane fields and forests. On social media, many demanded that his body not be honored or buried with dignity. Some argued that he deserved no grave, no marker, nothing to remember him by. The anger was raw, a testament to how deeply his crimes had scarred the nation. Within prison walls, his death was met with little ceremony. Fellow inmates, many of whom despised him, showed no sympathy. Guards, long accustomed to overseeing the frail old man, reported that his passing was quiet. He slipped into death as unremarkably as he had once moved through Colombia's towns, unnoticed until it was too late. The Colombian government released only a brief statement, confirming his death but offering no words of mourning. Officials knew that any gesture of humanity toward Garavito would enrage the public. Instead, the focus shifted to his victims, to remembering their names, their faces, their stolen childhoods. Candlelight vigils were held in some communities, not for the beast, but for the boys whose lives he had taken. For many, Garavito's death symbolized the closing of a chapter, but not the end of the story. The true legacy of his crimes lay in the reforms that followed. Colombia had begun to strengthen child protection services, to track missing children more effectively, and to debate harsher sentencing laws for crimes of this magnitude. His death reminded lawmakers and citizens alike of the cost of neglect. Psychologists, too, continued to wrestle with his legacy. Some argued that Garavito was the product of his environment. Abused as a child, raised in poverty, surrounded by violence. Others insisted that explanations could never excuse the cruelty he inflicted. The debate was endless, Was the beast born or made? The question would echo long after his death. In the end, Garavito died as he had lived for the last 2 decades, in isolation, despised, and studied. His passing brought no closure, no final act of justice, only the reminder of lives cut short and families left broken. Yet for Colombia, his death did mark something important, an end to the fear that one day, through legal loopholes or early release, he might walk free again. With his death, that fear was buried once and for all. As Chapter 9 closes, we see the beast in his final form. Not the cunning predator who once stalked boys in marketplaces, not the monster who lured children into sugarcane fields, but an old, broken man consumed by disease, his body finally surrendering to time. His death did not balance the scales of justice. It could not. But it did ensure one thing: Luis Alfredo Garavito would never again harm another child. The story of Luis Alfredo Garavito did not end with his death in 2023. In many ways, it will never end. The scars he left on Colombia run deeper than the grave that now holds his body. He murdered more than 100 children, perhaps many more, and in doing so, he became not only the most notorious serial killer in Colombian history, but one of the most prolific in the entire world. His legacy is not just one of horror, but of lessons that continue to shape law, psychology, and the lives of countless families. For the families of his victims, Garavito's name is a wound that never heals. Mothers and fathers who once searched desperately for their missing sons must live with the knowledge of what truly happened. In some cases, they never received their children's remains. Many graves remain unmarked, many bodies never identified. Even today, families still come forward, asking investigators whether their missing child could have been one of Garavito's victims. His crimes left behind not just tragedy, but uncertainty, an unending grief that passes from one generation to the next. Communities across Colombia remember him not to honor him, but to remind themselves of what can happen when society fails its most vulnerable. Garavito preyed on the poor, on displaced children, on those living in the shadows. His ability to hunt undetected for years exposed the weaknesses of Colombia's social safety nets. The lack of coordinated law enforcement and the neglect of children who had no one to protect them. That failure became a turning point. In the years after his arrest, Colombian lawmakers were forced to confront difficult questions. How could a man who confessed to murdering over 100 children face, at most, 40 years in prison? The revelation that Garavito could have theoretically been released angered a nation. Public outrage pushed for reform. Though Colombia's constitution prohibits life sentences and the death penalty, Garavito's case reopened those debates with new urgency. Politicians, legal scholars, and citizens argued passionately. Some insisted that extraordinary crimes required extraordinary punishments. Others cautioned that Colombia's democratic principles would be undermined by reactionary changes. The debates sparked reforms in sentencing for child murder and sexual violence. Laws were toughened. Child protection agencies received more funding. Systems to track missing children were improved, while no law could undo the crimes. They were attempts to ensure that another predator, like Garavito, would never be able to thrive in the same way again. His legacy then became a strange paradox, though born from horror. It forced Colombia to look inward and strengthen its defenses against future monsters. Psychologists and criminologists, too, continued to study him long after his death. Garavito became a case study in criminal pathology. What drove him? Was it the abuse he suffered as a child, the violence he witnessed, the neglect he endured? Or was there something darker inside him, something beyond explanation? Some argued that Garavito represented the extreme consequences of trauma left untreated. Others insisted that he was simply evil, a man who chose cruelty again and again. His life became both a warning and a puzzle, raising questions that science still struggles to answer. Yet, perhaps the most important part of Garavito's legacy lies not in law books or psychology journals, but in memory. Every year, Colombians remember his victims. Community vigils are held. Names are read aloud. Churches pray for the lost children. In some towns, murals have been painted in their honor, not of Garavito, but of the boys whose lives were stolen. These acts of remembrance transform the narrative. They ensure that history does not belong to the beast, but to those he tried to erase. His story also influenced global awareness of child protection. International human rights groups cited his case when pressing for stronger protections for children in conflict zones and impoverished regions. Garavito's crimes became a grim reminder that predators thrive in chaos, and that societies everywhere must protect their most vulnerable citizens. But the most haunting aspect of his legacy is the silence left behind. 100 childhoods never lived, 100 futures stolen, 100 voices cut short. Colombia's grief cannot be measured in numbers alone. It lives in empty chairs at dinner tables, in parents who grew old without their children, in siblings who carry the weight of memory. In death, Garavito became what he always should have been: powerless. His reign of terror ended, his life faded, his name consigned to the pages of history. But his victims remain alive in memory. Their stories, their innocence, and their stolen potential form the true legacy. Colombia's resilience in the face of such horror, its determination to never let another beast rise unnoticed, stands as the final answer to Garavito's crimes. As we close this chapter, we return to the beginning, a boy born into violence who became a man consumed by it. Luis Alfredo Garavito, the Beast of Colombia, lived and died in infamy. His crimes shocked the world, reshaped Colombia's justice system, and scarred thousands of lives. Yet his story is not one of him alone. It is a story of children who should have been protected, of families who never stopped fighting for answers, and of a nation determined to learn from its darkest nightmare. The legacy of horror is not Garavito's. It belongs to the memory of those he took, to the determination of those who survived, and to the promise that Colombia and the world must continue to uphold never again.